Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about plant medicines, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and our guest today is Manesh Girn. Manesh is in the latter stages of obtaining a PhD in neuroscience at McGill University, and he's published over a dozen scientific publications and book chapters on topics including psychedelics. He collaborates with leading researchers in the psychedelic science and is also the chief research officer at the psychedelic bioscience company, Indiotech Bioscience. In his free time, Manesh runs a YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, where he discusses the latest findings in psychedelic science in terms that a layperson can understand. Manesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
Thank you. So we are here today to discuss the very basics about psychedelics and plant medicine, what they are, what is going on with them right now, what they can do for someone, and what that might mean to me, an ordinary person. So let's roll our sleeves and just dig right in. First question, when we say psychedelics, talk to me like I'm a baby here. What exactly are psychedelics? What does that word really mean?
Yes, so there are a variety of ways to go about answering that. So one is, the standard way to describe it is there are a particular class of drugs. They're these substances which affect our brain and our mind, and it's a very unique set of drugs. So they don't fit into normal categories of drugs. Like, for example, when you think of stimulants like caffeine or amphetamines, these things, you take them and they stimulate you. It's very clear. Or there's things like alcohol, which usually, especially at higher amounts, depress you, relax you, or benzos or tranquilizers. But then psychedelics, they're not stimulants, they're not depressants. They're kind of this unique class of substances. And they're unique because they really can take you on a very immersive and intense experience. And an experience that is, to some extent, unpredictable. You don't absolutely know what you're going to be experiencing each time. More concretely, when we talk about psychedelics, we're talking about things like magic mushrooms or psilocybin, which is the chemical that's within them. Things like LSD or acid, as you might hear it, and things like DMT, which people might have heard of, and ayahuasca. And then there's ibogaine and salvia and a whole variety of other drugs. So these are drugs that have potent effects on our conscious experience that are not easily categorizable.
What exactly makes something a psychedelic?
This is a really good question. And, there's a disagreement on it. But how I see it is in terms of how they affect the brain. Without getting too technical, there's a particular brain receptor which psychedelics target, which these other drugs don't, the serotonin 2A receptor. So the drugs which seem to have particularly strong ability to activate this receptor induce very unique effects, which again involve this altered state of consciousness, you could say.
Let's step back a little bit, because you've used some words that, I'll be honest with you, I always feel like I should understand and know. But if someone were to ask me what they mean, I would have to confess. I would just stumble over my words and be busted. So serotonin, we all hear that word. What does that word mean?
Yes. So serotonin is a chemical that's found in your brain that you could say it helps, you could say, control or tune your brain's activity. This is in very simple terms, because the brain is a collection of cells, and these cells communicate electrically, but also chemically. So serotonin is one of the chemicals or neurotransmitters which influence the way your brain functions. And so what these psychedelic drugs do is they act as if they're serotonin and activate certain receptors in your brain and change brain activity in that way.
And what exactly are brain receptors?
Yeah, so
hey, you got to keep it real for me. These are all $5 words. I'm doing the best I can.
No, it's great to dive into this for sure. So at the risk of becoming too technical, we could say when you think of a brain cell, in order for another brain cell to affect that brain cell, it has to send chemicals at it. Like they usually don't touch each other physically, but at a distance, they send chemicals at each other. And the way a chemical will affect a neuron, a brain cell, is if it fits into its, like, you could think of these chemicals as keys and then the receptors as locks. So the key has to go into the lock in order to affect that brain cell. And so, yeah, these are the kind of the ways that brain cells communicate, or neurons as they're called.
I see. So if I'm understanding this correctly, the brain cells, they don't touch each other. they have little keyholes that enable them to activate, and then chemicals go between them to create some sort of brain activity. That brain activity and the chemicals that trigger that brain activity is serotonin, and the psychedelics basically create a serotonin-like impact within the brain. Is that all correct?
We could say, broadly speaking, yes.
Well, in any event, they have these sort of effects on the brain. When I hear psychedelics and I think about what these processes that we've just described are, I imagine hallucinations. I imagine altered states. I imagine hearing things or seeing things that don't exist. And I guess what I don't understand is how or why they do these things. And if that is what part of what defines something as a psychedelic.
Right. This is a really good question. I mean, well, people might know that an alternative term that's sometimes used is hallucinogen,
Yes.
But a lot of researchers and a lot of people these days don't like that term because the word, if we break down what these words mean, hallucinogen just means like hallucino, so hallucination, generating, so it creates hallucinations, as in you see things that aren't really there. Whereas psychedelic comes from two words, psyche and delos, where psyche means kind of mind or soul, and delos means to bring forth or to manifest. So it means to manifest the mind or to bring to awareness things that are latent and underlying. The reason why a lot of researchers think that's more accurate is because a lot of the time you don't have straight up hallucinations under a psychedelic. It's kind of a misnomer that you can take a little bit of mushrooms, you can all of a sudden start hallucinating things which are just not there at all, and you're going to have this complete detachment from reality. And now this may happen if you eat way, way, way too much. But at the normal doses people take, you're very unlikely to hallucinate full on. And moreover, that's arguably not the main aspect of the experience a lot of the time. The reason psychedelic is more apt is because a lot of people's experience is that they start to remember memories they had long forgotten. They might have a new perspective on what's going on in their life. They might feel like their sense of self has been shifted. There's a lot of changes that are independent of just seeing things, which really just reduces it to this one effect it has. And the word psychedelic acknowledges how complex and how variegated and multidimensional these experiences are.
Fascinating. Now, one thing that I have to be candid about is that when I hear the word psychedelic, or even some of the words that you use to describe some of these substances, like mushrooms earlier, I associate it with my homeboy down the street in Brooklyn that says he can get me some stuff for $7. Or that shady guy who was in my college dorm room just a couple of days ago when I graduated from college and was offering me all of these things. Is there a difference between what these substances might be that I'm hearing about or that I might associate with and the sort of substance that you're studying as a scientist?
Yes, I think there's a couple important points here. I think one is to separate psychedelics from quote unquote hard drugs, things that are addictive, you can get a physical dependence on, things like heroin or even cocaine or meth or all these kinds of things. The thing with psychedelics, and we know from a whole variety of studies in rats and humans, they're non-addictive. Your brain and your body cannot become dependent on them. So that makes them very different than these other drugs. And they're also not toxic for your brain. They don't damage your brain. That's kind of another misnomer that's out there. Psychedelics work very, very differently than these other drugs and don't have, at usual doses, that any reasonable dose a person would take, don't damage your brain or your physiology in any way. They're just psychologically very powerful. So in that way, they're very distinct from these other hard drugs.
Well, and that's actually interesting because when I hear the word drugs, at least here in the United States where I'm located, I do associate that with substances that tend to be addictive or tend to have an association with a long-term deterioration of brain function or behavioral patterns. In other words, you see people that are using too much of these drugs as often as not because they feel they have to decline over time. And that's something for me as a layperson, just sort of knowing the word drugs and associating it with that sort of outcome is scary.
Yes. I mean, this is a function of the drug war, right? And years of terrible drug education and basically propaganda, making people scared of drugs and demonizing people who use them and all sorts of nonsense that was rooted in racism initially, in the 1920s and 30s, going against African Americans and Mexicans and Chinese. And that's a whole other thing. We could talk about the drug war forever, but I think most people are not well educated on the effects of drugs and how they how harmful they could be, how addictive they really are. And hey, alcohol is obviously a drug. Caffeine is a drug. You take some Advil, you're taking a drug. And we have this weird, almost arbitrary relationship with drugs and what's good and bad.
Well, and I have to be candid about that. I do have a drug addiction, and it is to caffeine. I have my cup right here, and I can't make it through the day without. Yeah, exactly. we'll bond over that. I can't make it through the day without 4 or 5 of these cups. And if I do try and break free of it, I get all of these withdrawal symptoms and I decline in terms of my performance, my mood, all of that sort of stuff. But I think that the big takeaway that I get from this is that by using words broadly like drugs to discuss substances that are actually quite different in terms of their interaction with the brain and what they do to us when we use them, we're actually creating a false characterization of something that you're saying could serve a significant practical function for people. Otherwise, you wouldn't be researching it so much. Is all of that fair?
Yes, 100%. I think that's totally on the money. And I think we need better terminology, right? And this is why it's so great. In your introduction, you mentioned plant medicines. That has a very different connotation than drugs, because drugs is almost like a bad word, as you're saying, right? So I could speak to that a bit. Like, a lot of people in this space refer to certain psychedelics as plant medicines. When they say that, they're referring to the so-called natural psychedelics, that they occur naturally, in the environment somewhere. So these include like magic mushrooms, but also different vines and things that go into ayahuasca, for example. There's something called Banisteriopsis caapi and then Psychotria viridis, and these plants which contain psychedelic molecules. And then there's iboga, which comes from, it's like the bark of a shrub from Central Africa. And there's stuff like this, that they're natural compounds created by nature, which when consumed in a particular way, induce psychedelic effects. And these drugs have been researched more and more by top institutions, places like Johns Hopkins University, even Harvard has a center now, UCLA, a whole bunch of places, and in Europe too, showing that when used in particular ways, they can be very effective for therapy, amongst a variety of other things.
First of all, you talked about terminology and associations that we have with words right before you began that discussion that you just had a second ago. I do want to let the audience know, because you raised some really important historical points, that we are going to be having in the near future an episode that discusses the history of psychedelics and the war on drugs and how they came to be lumped together with these other substances in the near future. So I want to thank you for raising that, and just let anyone who's watching or listening know that if they continue to follow us, you're going to get a lot more information about that. Now, on to the discussion that you began with regards to plant medicine as a term. You hinted at something, but I just want to clarify it here. Is plant medicine a synonym for a psychedelic, or are they overlapping but not quite the same? And if so, what psychedelics are plant medicines? What plant medicines are psychedelics, and which aren't?
Yes, this is a good question. I think at the end of the day, the introduction of the term psychedelic medicines, plant medicines, is kind of rebranding for the purposes we've been talking about, right? So these inaccurate connotations that lead people to assume things that are not true. But what it is in general, plant medicine is a subset of psychedelics, you could say. It's the ones as plant, in the phrase implies, that come naturally from plants or fungi, basically. These include stuff like I mentioned earlier. And the thing, what wouldn't be included under that heading, but is a psychedelic, are stuff like LSD and a whole variety of other compounds. Some people call MDMA a psychedelic. I don't really think it's a psychedelic. But then there's a whole variety of other compounds that are, you could say, synthetic analogs or similar compounds to mushrooms and natural compounds, but are made in a lab. And it's an open question, should we see those as plant medicines or not? But there are a lot of people out there who are kind of purists and just like the natural things that nature has given us. And usually plant medicine is used to refer to those.
There are also medicines that I know about that are out there for prescription. And I personally have known people who have used them. They are for a number of different conditions, at least that I'm aware of, that are associated with brain problems that cause as side effects, or maybe even, for all I know, part of their principal function is to create brain activity that leads to hallucinations. Are these types of medicines psychedelics, or are they distinct from what you're talking about?
I'd have to know specifically which drugs, but very likely no. They're not psychedelics. They're distinct, and they're drugs that work probably in different ways over time. If you take them on a consistent basis, they can lead to these kinds of effects. The thing with psychedelics, the whole model around their use in therapy and in research, for example, is that you don't need to take them every day. You need to maybe take it maybe 3 sessions over a period of 3 months. And in certain studies, people, for example, have had their depression relieved for a year later after only 3 sessions. So they're not like your standard antidepressant or these other drugs you have to take every day, in which, impact your ability to live your life how you want to live it, even if they might help you get better a little bit. Psychedelics are very different from those.
And I'm really glad that you went as to that, because this really goes as to the next question. Depression. I've known various family members, people in my friendship circle, or people that I may have met through online communities that have really suffered from depression. I was speaking the other day to a woman who I have known for a number of years who's been hospitalized a number of times because she has this crippling depression that she can't get over. She's tried every traditional medicine in the book. She's been in talk therapy for years. Meanwhile, there are other people that might not be suffering from that sort of depression, but may have suffered from things like post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah, I had a very, very difficult childhood. I've been open about that on this show, and I will be open about that on this show. And I went to talk counseling for years to deal with the traumatic response that I had to that, and the fact that it was something that I couldn't get over, years of nightmares and anxiety and things like that. People that are veterans or that live in war zones, I can only imagine how much worse they have it. There are types of medicines that you've mentioned so far. Do they do different things? And what types of medicines or what psychedelics are best known for helping with what particular challenges that people might be facing?
This is a great question. Thank you. So there's two things that come to mind here. There's psilocybin, which is the compound in magic mushrooms, and how that's been shown in studies so far to be very effective for depression. And then on the other side, there's MDMA, which sometimes people call Molly, but this is the pure version of it, using that with therapy for treating PTSD. So I'll start with the depression piece, because you're totally right. It can be a very debilitating disorder, and it's one of I think something like 250 million people suffer from it, or something like this. That's one of the estimates. That was probably a pre-COVID estimate, and so who knows now, right?
Yeah.
And something that's striking in the research actually is the people in these studies that come and get administered psilocybin often have had depression for maybe 10, 20 years, have tried antidepressants, they haven't worked, have tried everything and just can't shake it. They come in and they describe feeling like they're in a box. They feel like they're in a prison. They can't escape their negative thoughts about themselves and their life. They feel unlovable. They feel disconnected from others and society, and disconnected from themselves. They don't, they have no touch with what they like anymore and who they truly are. It really seems a lot of the times as a kind of psychological disconnection syndrome. That's really what it seems for a lot of people, from what people describe in these studies. And the thing with psilocybin, again, the compound in magic mushrooms, when you use it in this particular context where you're taking it while lying on bed with two therapists on your side, you've chatted with them a whole bunch prior to the experience, you know they support you, you feel connected to them, and you're lying there and you have eye shades on with music, and you're going on this inner journey for about 6 to 8 hours. And they're just there to support you, but really you're on your own journey with them there. And people come out of that saying things like, for the first time in a long while, I was able to feel connected to people in my life. I had memories of my interactions with family members. I was able to forgive things I was holding on to. I was able to see how I wasn't showing up for my family, or how I was neglecting X, Y, and Z, and just feel this deeper sense of connection to people in their lives, to themselves, and then to something greater than themselves, often construed as the universe, or it could be God, or it could be nature, it could be whatever. So there's like this triple connection, self, other, and world. And they come out of this feeling like themselves again, and remembering who they are, and remembering what's important in their life, and feeling what it's like to escape that mental prison and see the broader picture, and see that joy and the beauty in life again. And it's like these very, very profound experiences people are having. And it's not like they're instantly cured forever after that, but their depression will go down for a while. And if they work on it, there's huge potential there.
And I've got to say, imagine what people say depression is like. everything is bleak and dark, like you're living out a hellscape. And to get a moment of light and connection and positive feeling when you're trapped in this well, I can't even imagine how profound that would be and how meaningful that would be for anyone, even if it doesn't last. So, wow. Thank you for explaining that so vividly. Now, talk to me a little bit more about the other types then.
Yeah, so the other is, this one's probably going to become available to psychiatrists in the next year or two, maybe a couple of years. It's MDMA therapy for PTSD. So now when we think of PTSD, it's usually, the person has suffered through one or more traumatic experiences, right? Where a traumatic experience is an experience that has overwhelmed your mind and nervous system, and you weren't able to respond to it in that moment. And so what happens is it kind of gets stored within you, within your body, as kind of like, you could say, trapped energy and emotion, and also leads to intrusive memories to constantly be triggered and come into your awareness and trigger a fear response. And you're kind of in this state of always not truly feeling safe in your body, being hypersensitive to threats, to being hypersensitive to stress. And of course, this can be hugely debilitating and lead to a variety of other disorders. And the thing that makes PTSD so hard to treat is because as soon as you get close to that memory that's causing it, you basically can't handle it and it's overwhelming. So you're like, get me away from that. I'm going to avoid every situation that brings me anywhere close to that. The fascinating thing about MDMA is it puts you into this state of kind of emotional groundedness and kind of almost euphoria, like a loving euphoria, where you have the space to process these extremely intense memories without being overwhelmed. So it kind of allows you to enter these things and reduces your fear response. And so when you couple that with therapy, with a kind of exposure therapy of gently, incrementally going into these memories and exploring them and seeing that it's just a memory, you're actually safe, and retraining your nervous system to feel safe and to process these memories. By doing that, MDMA seems to be the most effective thing we've ever seen by far for treating PTSD. And this is why it's like very close to being prescribed to people, because it puts you in a state where you can actually process these memories.
Right. Now, you've talked about plant medicines that are having a dramatic impact on people's lives, particularly their mental health. I have also heard and read, just as background noise, all sorts of things about a whole variety of other brain or emotional challenges that people face that psychedelics can help with. And I've got to say, when I see some of these claims, I'm reminded of pot and
Yeah.
And cannabis, which allegedly can solve everything from foot pain to bad hair days. And that leads to another question, which is pot a plant medicine? And if so, what differentiates it from what we're talking about?
Yes, so many people would construe cannabis as a plant medicine, and I think it is. It very much is, but it isn't a psychedelic, as is usually construed. And because it doesn't affect that same serotonin receptor I mentioned before, it doesn't target that. But it is a plant medicine. And yeah, some people do call cannabis a psychedelic, but I think then we're stretching the definitions and we're not clear on what actually a psychedelic is.
And I did want to be clear as we go forward with this, that generally we're going to be talking about substances of the sort that you mentioned earlier in the conversation and not cannabis. So every time I open a magazine or read the newspaper, especially since I signed up to do this podcast, it seems as though psychedelics are there. I don't know what it is. Maybe the minute you start being aware of something, it's suddenly everywhere. But it does seem to me that irrespective of that particular phenomena, that this seems to be rising to prominence as an issue now. Why now?
Yes, it's a good question. I think we'll just look around you. I mean, people are struggling with their mental health. It's rough times. The economy is tanking. There's so much uncertainty politically. We're just coming out of COVID and trying to adapt to this new world, and it's rough times, right? And I think that combined with just the inadequacy of our treatments for mental health for so many years, when you think of psychiatry these days, you think of being prescribed a drug, and we haven't had significant innovation in mental health drugs since like the 80s. You basically are getting the same thing with slight tweaks just so they can make more money and patent more things, basically. And so there's this huge need for innovative treatments for mental health that represent a kind of paradigm shift in how we approach mental illness. And psychedelics and all their promise in the studies so far suggest that they represent just that, the innovation that's sorely needed, which I think is medicines which allow you to actually go deep into your mind and work on those things and process those things which underlie your disorders, instead of just sweeping them under the rug like normal drugs do. It's like these experience-based medicines which give you insight and allow you to shift your perspective on life. That's why there's so much potential there, and that's why they're resonating with the culture these days, because people know that they need it.
Well, and that goes as to the next question that I was thinking about even before you said that, which, as I mentioned earlier, PTSD is something I've struggled with in my own life. And part of what I have to say that I ask myself here is, why would I need another medicine? Or why would I need another treatment modality? Or why would I need anything else? Why is there any sort of desire to continually push more and more and more on us? It really hadn't occurred to me that this was something fundamentally different, particularly in the way that you just described it, around it being experiential as opposed to just suppressing symptoms. And so can you maybe explain a little bit more what that might mean to someone like me who has gone through PTSD, knows what that's like, and why an experiential approach to what I'm facing, or it doesn't even have to be PTSD, it could be something else altogether, why that might be a better way of handling it than just suppressing those symptoms and pretending like my problem doesn't exist.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, we all have demons. Everyone has stuff they haven't processed that they hid in their closet. Could be from childhood, could be from adulthood, could be from wherever. And when people are in their most sober, clear moment, they'll recognize, yes, this is probably underlying these issues I'm having. But usually it's very hard to go there. And especially without the support, it could be destabilizing and overwhelming, especially with PTSD. That's the hallmark of PTSD, having an overwhelming experience within you that can come out easily with a particular trigger, and living in fear of that, and et cetera. So I think what psychedelics like MDMA and psychedelics offer is a way for you to go into not slightly, but an altered state, which is more conducive to exploring those things, which might bring you up those memories you had long repressed, which might give you the emotional space to be able to hold space for these emotions and allow them to come up and really experience what you need to experience and process what you need to process.
You said earlier, by the way, that these substances have not had the sort of toxicity associated with them that a lot of other drugs have. And I gotta say, again, just man on the street here, I'm a little bit skeptical. You mentioned that these drugs take the mind into an altered state. How can it be that this is not going to damage my brain? How is that even possible if coffee or other alcohol, for instance, which, like you mentioned earlier in the discussion, and we all know has been legal around the world since time immemorial, if that can cause brain damage, how plausible is it really that psychedelics aren't toxic that same way?
Right. I mean, it comes down to how they work in the brain. It's very different. For example, I mean, things such as amphetamines, or like, you say methamphetamine, or even cocaine and these other drugs, and they work by causing your brain to really release a lot of a particular neurotransmitter, a lot of a particular chemical beyond what is normal, what the brain would ever do naturally, basically. And it pumps your brain full of these chemicals, and kind of not only does it deplete your storage of them, it overwhelms the receptors and can therefore cause receptors to be damaged, you could say, and neurons to die and all of the rest. The way psychedelics work, again, is they don't work necessarily by making your brain pump out all sorts of chemicals, but they just are very potent at acting like those chemicals and activating certain neurons, you could say, and changing brain activity that way. So in that sense, they're not causing your brain to release inordinate amounts of certain compounds, but rather modulating the brain in different ways. So that's partially the answer. And also the psychedelics don't strongly target your brain's reward system. Things like meth, things like cocaine, really hack into your reward system. That's what makes it so addictive. But psychedelics don't necessarily do that.
Interesting. Really interesting. These substances, if used in the manner that we have been discussing during the episode today, are meant to change folks. If I were to use them and they were to change me, what would I expect to become afterwards?
Yes, it's a good question. Of course, it'll be different for everybody. But I think what people often describe in the trials, I'll go back to that, is like they feel more of a spaciousness in their life, more of an ability to appreciate the little things, appreciate their garden, appreciate nature, their relationships and their little moments. And it seems to give people, snaps them out of their dream walking and brings them back to life and their ability to engage with things. So people do report like a higher life satisfaction and quality of life after psilocybin therapy, for example, and they're able to, yeah, just connect with life on a deeper level again. In addition to that, I think a major aspect of this whole thing is they give people greater self-awareness. We will get greater insight into how your habits of thinking and perceiving and your beliefs, how they're influencing you and maybe are negative for your life or positive for your life. You'll gain some real insight into that. How I see psychedelics a lot of the time are these like introspective enhancers. They enhance your ability to go within and see things from almost like a third person perspective, kind of like meditation or mindfulness. But it really just throws you into that state and you're able to see a lot of things you couldn't see before. And a lot of that you remember and you take with you into your day to day.
When you were talking a few minutes ago about deeper appreciation of what you have or that sense of spaciousness, I live in a 500 square foot apartment and I live with a spouse. And during the early days of the pandemic, being in this small of a space with another person 24/7 nonstop, we get along. But we have that little garden right outside our window. And sometimes that garden, Manesh, it was all that I had. And I can't help but imagine if I were someone who were psychologically caught in a 500 square foot apartment, feeling trapped mentally all the time without that garden, how much having that garden would mean. And so I really want to thank you for sharing that metaphor with us because that might affect someone else the way it just spoke to me. What are one or two things you'd like us to take away from our conversation today if folks can't remember anything else?
Yeah, I think with respect to psychedelics, they're hugely promising. They have a lot of promise in revolutionizing mental health treatments, as we've been discussing. But it's important to say they're not for everybody. And when I talk about them, I'm talking about them in very specific contexts where you're doing it in a place where you feel safe and secure with somebody who's there to watch over you, preferably somebody trained, a therapist or a facilitator. And with a lot of introspection beforehand and having a strong intention, I want to work on this in my life. And then really going into it with the intention to grow and face what you need to face. And that's very essential. And because I'm sure many people listening, even you probably heard of people doing mushrooms or LSD at a festival with nothing wrong with that, or even just on the street and messing around, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, they didn't have insights and they didn't change their depression. Yeah. Well, the context is so important with these drugs. They're really, in a sense, context enhancers. Whatever you're around, the energy you're occupying, the intention that you have, that's going to be brought out by the psychedelic. So I think it's really important to approach these drugs with a lot of respect and care and be mindful that when we talk about all these benefits, we're talking about using them in a particular way, in a particular context.
Really appreciate that. Manesh, how can folks find out more about you?
For sure. So a few different ways. So I do have a YouTube channel where I share some of the science. I think you mentioned in the intro. So the YouTube channel is The Psychedelic Scientist. So you can search me on YouTube for that. I haven't made some videos in a few months, but I'm planning to get back into it. Also have an Instagram on the same name. And then for me personally, I can keep up with my stuff on Twitter. So I'm M Girn, MGIRN, Neuro, NEURO. And then also on LinkedIn. So feel free to add me on LinkedIn and reach out there too.
Thank you. Manesh, it's been excellent having you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing all of this knowledge and wisdom.
For sure, Scott. It's truly my pleasure.
It really has been. And for those of you who are listening or watching, keep tuning in. In upcoming episodes, we'll be discussing the most common plant medicines in much more detail with scientists, renowned journalists, and some regular folks just like you and me. We'll discuss the history of psychedelics and the truth about why regular people like you and I don't know more about them. We're going to talk about their relationship to Western medicine and one of the most important considerations of all we just touched on today, safety. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or comment, and tell folks that you care about what we're doing. Also, don't forget to follow Webdelics on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS webdelics.com and sign up to get our blog for trusted educational information about plant medicines on the web. Then join us next time for another episode of the WebDelics podcast.